I walked into the new hire training session on my first Monday at Dataflow Systems, knowing I had more technical experience than anyone else in the room. And within 20 minutes, I understood that none of that experience was going to matter because the lead trainer had already decided I was going to be his target. The company was a mid-sized enterprise data analytics firm in Austin, about 800 employees, and I had been hired as a senior data engineer with a specialty in real-time pipeline architecture and distributed systems, skills that were in high demand and that had commanded a significant salary premium during the negotiation process. The training was supposed to be a standard onboarding program covering company policies, system architecture, and development workflows, and most of it was being delivered by a man named Jason Carmichael, who held the title of principal engineer and who had been with the company for 9 years. Jason was in his mid-40s, wore expensive tech company hoodies, and carried himself with the kind of casual arrogance that comes from being the longest-tenured technical person in the room and never having that status challenged. There were 12 people in the training cohort, split roughly evenly between engineers and product managers, and I was the only woman in the engineering track. Jason opened the session by going around the room and asking everyone to introduce themselves. And when he got to me and I mentioned my background in distributed systems and stream processing, he smiled in a way that made my jaw tight and said that was interesting because those were exactly the areas where new hires usually struggled the most with the company's architecture, and he hoped I was ready to unlearn a lot of what I thought I knew. The comment was delivered as though it were helpful advice, but the tone was dismissive and the implication was clear. He did not believe I had the skills I claimed, and he was going to enjoy proving it. Over the next 3 days, Jason found every opportunity to single me out. When he explained the company's data ingestion pipeline, he asked me to diagram the architecture on the whiteboard, then interrupted me halfway through to point out that I had used the wrong terminology for one of the components. A terminology difference that was purely semantic and had no impact on the actual design, and suggested that I review the basics before moving forward. When he demonstrated a debugging technique using the company's internal monitoring tools, he called on me to replicate the process in front of the group, then stood behind me while I worked and made comments about how I was taking too long and how experienced engineers should be able to navigate these systems more quickly. When another engineer in the cohort asked a question about latency optimization, Jason turned to me and asked if I wanted to answer since that was supposed to be my area of expertise. And when I provided a technically accurate explanation, he nodded slowly and said that was one approach, but there were more efficient methods that I would learn once I understood how the company's systems actually worked. Every interaction was designed to undermine me, to position me as less knowledgeable than I claimed, and to signal to the rest of the cohort that I did not belong at the senior level I had been hired into. And the worst part was that no one else in the room seemed to notice, or if they did, they chose not to say anything. On the third day of training, Jason assigned a hands-on technical exercise where each engineer was supposed to build a small data processing pipeline using the company's framework and then present their solution to the group. I completed the exercise in half the time it took the other engineers, implemented an optimization that reduced processing latency by 30% compared to the baseline solution, and added error handling that accounted for edge cases the original specification had not mentioned. When it was my turn to present, I walked through the architecture, explained the optimization technique, and demonstrated the performance improvement with actual metrics. Jason listened without interrupting, which should have been a good sign, but instead made me uneasy because I could see him taking notes and I knew he was preparing a critique. When I finished, he asked if I had tested the solution against the full production dataset or just the sample data provided in the exercise. I said I had used the sample data because that was what the exercise specified. He nodded and said that was the problem with senior hires who came in with a lot of confidence. They tended to optimize for the specific case in front of them without thinking about how their solutions would scale in the real world, and that my approach, while clever, would likely fail under production load because I had not accounted for memory constraints and network latency in the distributed environment. He said this in front of the entire cohort with a tone that was simultaneously patient and condescending, and then he moved on to the next presentation without giving me an opportunity to respond. I sat down, my face burning, and spent the rest of the session replaying his critique in my head and realizing that he had deliberately framed the exercise in a way that would allow him to criticize any solution I produced, regardless of how good it was. I did not complain to HR. I did not send an angry email. I finished the training program, thanked Jason for his time, and started my actual role on the data engineering team, but I also started paying attention. I noticed that Jason was not just the lead trainer, he was also the technical gatekeeper for the entire engineering organization, the person who reviewed architecture proposals, approved technology choices, and had final say on hiring decisions for senior roles. I noticed that he had a pattern of being dismissive toward anyone who challenged his technical opinions or proposed approaches that differed from his preferred methods, and that several engineers who had pushed back on his decisions had either left the company or been moved to less visible projects. I noticed that he was particularly hostile toward women in technical roles, and that the company had a significant gender imbalance in its senior engineering ranks despite claiming to prioritize diversity in its public communications. And I noticed that Jason's technical decisions, while often defended with appeals to performance and scalability, were not always backed by data and sometimes reflected personal preferences rather than objective engineering analysis. I documented all of this. I kept notes on meetings where Jason dismissed proposals without adequate justification. I tracked the outcomes of projects where his technical guidance had been followed versus projects where teams had quietly worked around his recommendations, and I waited. The opportunity came 4 months into my tenure. The company was preparing to launch a major new product feature that required a complete redesign of the real-time analytics pipeline, exactly the kind of project that matched my core expertise. The VP of Engineering assigned me as the technical lead, which meant I would be responsible for the architecture, the implementation plan, and the coordination across multiple teams. It also meant that my design proposal would need to be reviewed and approved by Jason before we could proceed. I spent 2 weeks building the proposal and I made sure it was flawless. I included performance benchmarks, cost projections, failure mode analyses, and comparisons with alternative approaches. I documented every technical decision, cited academic papers and industry best practices, and included a risk mitigation plan that addressed every potential objection I could anticipate. Then I submitted the proposal to Jason and requested a review meeting. The meeting was scheduled for a Friday afternoon, and I came prepared with additional materials, backup data, and responses to the critiques he had made during the training session 4 months earlier. Jason opened the meeting by saying he had reviewed the proposal and had some concerns. He said the architecture was overly complex, that it introduced unnecessary dependencies on external systems, and that it would be difficult to maintain. I asked him to identify specific components that he considered overly complex. He pointed to the distributed coordination layer, which was essential for ensuring consistency across the pipeline. I explained why that layer was necessary and showed him the data demonstrating that removing it would result in data integrity issues. He said the data was based on theoretical scenarios and that in practice those issues rarely occurred. I showed him production logs from our current system where those exact issues had occurred 17 times in the past 3 months. He shifted to a different objection, saying the cost projections were unrealistic. I walked him through the calculations line by line. He said my assumptions about usage patterns were wrong. I showed him historical usage data that supported my assumptions. For every objection he raised, I had a response backed by data, and by the end of the meeting it was clear that his concerns were not technical, they were personal. He did not want to approve a design that came from someone he had dismissed as unqualified, and he especially did not want to approve a design that was better than what he would have produced himself. Jason did not approve the proposal. Instead, he sent an email to the VP of Engineering saying that he had reviewed my architecture and recommended that we pursue an alternative approach based on a simpler design that would be easier to implement and maintain. He did not provide detailed technical justification. He did not reference any of the data I had presented. He simply asserted that his approach was better and that as the principal engineer with the most experience in the company's systems, his judgment should carry more weight than mine. The VP of engineering, who was new to the role and did not have a deep technical background, deferred to Jason's recommendation and asked me to revise the proposal to align with his guidance. I did not argue. I went back to my desk, opened a new document, and started building a different kind of case. Over the next 6 weeks, I documented every technical decision Jason had made as principal engineer that had resulted in problems. I pulled post-mortem reports from system outages and identified the root causes that traced back to architectural choices he had championed. I reviewed the project timelines for major initiatives over the past 2 years and calculated the cost overruns and delays that had occurred on projects where Jason had been the technical lead. I interviewed engineers who had worked with him and collected their experiences, not gossip but specific technical disagreements where Jason had overruled sound engineering judgment and the results had been negative. I compiled performance data showing that teams which had worked around Jason's recommendations had delivered better outcomes than teams that had followed his guidance. And I built a financial analysis showing that the company had spent approximately $3.2 million over the past 18 months on infrastructure problems, technical debt, and failed projects that could be traced directly to Jason's decisions. The document was 41 pages and every claim was supported by data, email threads, meeting notes, or production metrics. I did not send the document to the VP of engineering. I sent it to the Chief Technology Officer, a woman named Dr. Rebecca Alvarez, who had joined the company 8 months earlier from a major tech company and who had a reputation for being data-driven and intolerant of organizational politics that interfered with technical excellence. I sent the document with a brief cover email explaining that I had been asked to revise my architecture proposal to align with guidance from the principal engineer, but that before doing so I wanted to provide context on the track record of that guidance and the potential risks of continuing to defer to it. I did not make it personal. I did not accuse Jason of sexism or bias. I simply presented the data and let Dr. Alvarez draw her own conclusions. She responded 3 hours later asking me to meet with her the following morning. At that meeting, she asked me to walk her through the document in detail. I did. She asked follow-up questions about specific incidents, requested access to the underlying data sources, and took extensive notes. Then she asked me whether I thought Jason was technically incompetent or whether there was another explanation for the pattern of poor decisions. I said I thought Jason was technically competent but that he had been in the principal engineer role for so long without meaningful oversight that he had started prioritizing his own authority over objective technical analysis, and that this was creating a bottleneck that was hurting the company. She nodded, thanked me for the analysis, and said she would look into it. 2 weeks later, Dr. Alvarez announced an organizational restructuring. The principal engineer role was being eliminated and replaced with a technical architecture review board composed of 3 senior engineers who would collectively evaluate architecture proposals and technology decisions. Jason would remain with the company as a senior staff engineer focused on infrastructure optimization, but he would no longer have unilateral authority over technical decisions. The new review board would include me as one of the 3 members. Jason did not take the change well. He sent an email to the engineering leadership team arguing that the restructuring was unnecessary and that it would slow down decision-making and create confusion. Dr. Alvarez responded with a brief note saying the decision had been made based on a comprehensive analysis of engineering outcomes and that the new structure would be more aligned with industry best practices. Jason stopped responding to emails after that. Over the next 3 months, his performance deteriorated. He missed deadlines, submitted substandard work, and became increasingly combative in meetings. Dr. Alvarez documented every incident, provided coaching and feedback, and gave Jason multiple opportunities to improve. He did not. In early April, 6 months after I had walked into that training session and been publicly humiliated in front of my cohort, I sat in a meeting with Dr. Alvarez and the VP of People Operations where we reviewed Jason's performance record and the decision to terminate his employment for failure to meet expectations. Dr. Alvarez asked me, as a member of the Technical Architecture Review Board, to review the documentation and confirm that the decision was justified from a technical performance standpoint. I reviewed it. It was justified. I signed the recommendation. Jason was terminated the following week. I did not feel triumphant. I did not celebrate. I felt a cold, quiet satisfaction that came from knowing that the system, when properly documented and presented to the right decision-makers, would eventually correct itself. Jason had assumed that his seniority, his tenure, and his status as the technical authority would protect him from accountability. He had assumed that dismissing me in training, undermining my proposals, and blocking my architecture would have no consequences because no one would challenge him. He was wrong. I documented his failures. I presented them to someone with the authority and the willingness to act, and I waited for the system to run its course. The humiliation he inflicted on me in that training room was deliberate and designed to establish dominance. But he made one critical error. He assumed I would accept it, internalize it, and allow it to define my place in the organization. Instead, I used it as motivation to build a case so thorough and so data-driven that when the moment came to make a decision about his future, there was only one rational conclusion. He humiliated me in training. 6 months later, I signed his termination. And the distance between those two moments was filled with documentation, precision, and the patient application of the same technical rigor he had claimed I lacked.